Cleary. Chapter 7. This is the final chapter, Henry's Little Shadow. Afterwards, Henry realized that he should have known something would go wrong with his plan to keep Ramona from pestering him. Now, because he was a friend of Sheriff Bud, Henry had become such a hero to Ramona that she wanted to follow him wherever he went. Next, Mrs. Quimby said that she was disgusted with Sheriff Bud program and Ramona was not to watch it anymore. Not ever. This left Ramona plenty of time for tagging after Henry. The worst part of it was there was nothing Henry could do about Ramona's tagging along because she behaved herself. She stood quietly on Mr. Capper's driveway while Henry folded his papers. Henry began to wish she would pester him so he could yell at her to go away. Fortunately, none of the other paper carriers thought much about her because many small children in the neighborhood admired the big boys who delivered the papers. Henry was always glad to spring on his bicycle and ride away from her. If he had delivered his papers on foot, she would have tagged after him. Then one day at school, Bija said, Henry, I don't think you are going to like what Ramona is going to get for Christmas. What is she getting? Asked Henry. Bija looked worried. I'm not supposed to tell. I just thought I better warn you is all. Henry did not know what to make of his message. He did not see how a doll or whatever it was that a girl in kindergarten was going to get for Christmas could bother him. As for himself, he hoped he would get a sleeping bag because he had not saved his paper road money as fast as he had expected. He had spent quite a bit on nails and a padlock for the clubhouse, and when he counted the money he had collected for his paper route, he found he was short a couple of dollars and realized he must have made some mistakes in giving change. These cut into his profits, and after he had done his Christmas shopping, he was still several dollars short of a sleeping bag. Henry was not disappointed on Christmas morning when he opened a big package and found not a sleeping bag but a microscope. He could have a lot of fun with the microscope. It was so cold his mother would not let him sleep outdoors anyway, and next month he would have enough money to buy the sleeping bag. It was not until Christmas afternoon when Henry was folding his papers that Henry found out what Bejas meant. He looked up and saw Ramona standing there on the driveway in her snowsuit. Henry dropped the paper he was folding when he saw that over her shoulders she was wearing a cloth bag, a small copy of the one journal carriers wore. It even had read the journals embroidered on it in red yarn embroidered. It was terrible. In each half of her bag, Ramona carried some old rolled up newspapers. She also carried a battered teddy bear in the front half. She was smiling proudly. Naturally, the other carriers practically laughed themselves sick at the sight of the Henry's admirer. Red with embarrassment, Henry tried to pretend he did not see Ramona. He bent over and folded papers as fast as he could so he could get out of there. Henry, see what Santa Claus brought me, said Ramona, ignoring the laughter. Now I can be a paper boy like you. The other boys whooped. Why don't you go home? Henry asked crossly. I want to watch, said Ramona politely. Henry could see that in spite of the boys' laughter, Ramona was proud of her very own journal bag and there was nothing he could do about it. Because she had kept her promise to Sheriff Bud and was being good. Henry could see that another of his good ideas had turned out wrong. Even when Ramona was good, she was a problem. Then Beja's wearing a brand new Christmas car coat with a hood and came hurrying up the driveway. Come on home, Ramona, she said, then turned to Henry. I tried to warn you. A journal bag was the only thing she wanted for Christmas, and so mother had to make her own one. She had a terrible time. She couldn't find a pattern. Henry slung his bag of journals over his shoulders. Thanks anyway, he said ruefully as he threw his leg over his bicycle and rode away from Ramona and the laughter of the other boys. The next morning, when Henry woke up, he discovered that snow was beginning to fall. A few light flakes at first, and then more and larger flakes. What luck! Snow during Christmas vacation. He looked out of his bedroom window and saw that there was already an inch of snow on the roof of the clubhouse. After breakfast, Henry dragged his flexible flyer out of the basement to have it ready in case there was enough snow for coasting. All morning snow fell. By noon, it was easy to roll up a snowman. The police blocked off a hill. Girls went coasting. Handy slid so much and got into so many snow fights. He had to go home and put his clothes through his mother's clothes dryer before he could go out again. Cars that did not have snow tires slid on the icy pavement and skidded into the curbs. Some people who were furniture enough to have their chains with them thumb down the stairs as snow packed down into ice. By 3 o'clock, the street and ski blocked by the skidding cars. Mrs. Hagen looked into the refrigerator and the cupboards to see how much food she had on hand because she could not go to market and there was no telling when the milkman could get through. The whole city was in a wonderful state of confusion, and Henry enjoyed every minute of it. He hoped it would be days, even weeks before the snow thawed, and then mailman and a muffler tied over his ears and his hat on top of that came puffing up the steps hours late. The sight of his reminded Henry that he had work to do, and it was not going to be easy in this weather. Snow or no snow, the journal had to be delivered. And dried his wooden gloves in the dryer for the third time that day before he started out, this time on foot at Mr. Capper's garage. He had a long cool wait before the truck that brought the papers was able to get through. Foot of Snow, Blanket City was the headline that day. In spite of the cold, Ramona also waited in her snowsuit with her little journal bag over her shoulders. She kept busy by making a snowman on the driveway. Fadata, 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 she said to herself as she worked. When the snowman was finished, she tried her journal bag on it. Henry hoped she would leave it there, but she did not. She put it over her own shoulders again. When Henry had managed to fold his papers with fingers numbed by the cold, he discovered that this time Ramona could tag after him. Because he had to cover his route on foot and follow him through the snow, she did, about 10 feet behind him, even though walking was not easy. In some places, the snow had drifted. In others, it was packed down into ice. Henry walked as fast as he could, but Ramona struggled along after him. A man who was trying to shovel snow in front of his house grinned at Henry and said, I see you have a little shadow. Henry was mighty glad to see Bee just clumping through the snow in harbors. Come on home, Ramona, she coaxed. It's getting colder. No, said Ramona. I want to go with Henry. She chugged along in her boards, and there was nothing for Bijas to do but follow along and keep an eye on her. Henry threw the first paper, which landed with a plop in the snow that had drifted on his customer's front steps. Softly, a few flakes of snow fell on the paper. This isn't going to work, thought Henry. The papers would get buried on his side of the street where the snow was drifting. Nobody would be able to find them. He struggled up the front walk, his heavy journal bag banging against his legs, and picked the paper out of the drift. Then he rang the doorbell and handed the paper to his customer, who thanked him and said with a smile, I see you have a little shadow. Yeah, said Henry without enthusiasm. Henry soon saw that it was too much work to wade through drifts with his journal bag bumping against his legs. Be just do me a favor, will you? He asked. Go get my sled for me. It will take quite a while if I have to take Ramona with me, said Bijas. I could go faster without her. Henry realized this was true. Ramona's legs were short and the snow was almost to the top of her boots. He did need that sled though, okay? She can tag along with me, he said, knowing she would, whether he wanted her to or not. Silently, Ramona floundered along after him, and Henry grudgingly admired to himself that she was not pestering him. She had a perfect right to be on the sidewalk, didn't she? If only she were not wearing the ridiculous journal bag, and if only everyone he met would not say, I see you have a little shadow. Once Ramona said companionably, there is an easy house number, 1001. She was proud of her new ability to read numbers. Henry did not answer her. It was not long until Beatrice came, dragging Henry's sled behind her. He was mighty glad to the papers from his shoulders and sat them on the sled. Come on, Ramona, coaxed Beatrice. You can be a paper boy some other day. No, I can't, said Ramona in a small voice. Henry always rides his bicycle and I can't keep up with him. So on they chugged. The next house on the snowdrift side of the street was the house of Mrs. Peabody. Henry took a paper from his sled, waded up to the front door, and rang the doorbell. Why, it's Henry Huggins. It's it's Harry Huggins, exclaimed Mrs. Peabody, opening the door just a crack so the cold would not come. But you are a thoughtful boy to bring the paper right to the front door. This name isn't Harry Huggins, Ramona shouted. His name is Henry Huggins. Mrs. Peabody looked startled and opened the door a bit wider. Is it really? She asked Henry. Well, yes, admitted Henry, but that's all right. Just the same, he was grateful to Ramona for straightening Mrs. Peabody, but out. He felt almost kindly toward the little girl in spite of that terrible journal bag. I'm sorry, said Mrs. Peabody, to think that I have been calling you Harry Huggins all this time when your name is really Henry Huggins. I don't see how I could have made such a mistake. Oh, I knew who you meant. Henry was embarrassed. Ramona began to cry. Come on, let's go home, said Beatrice impatiently, and Ramona cried harder. I'm too tired, she sobbed. Why, the poor little thing, said Mrs. Peabody. She is all worn out. If I could get my car out of the garage, I would drive her home myself. Henry looked at Ramona standing there sobbing in the snow. Her face was red with cold and blotched her with tears, with her boots buried in snow. She looked even smaller than she really was. She rubbed her eyes with her cold, soggy mitten and sniffed pitifully, and Henry's feelings were all mixed up. He remembered how she had locked him in the clubhouse and what a pest she had been. At the same time, he was grateful to her because she had told Mrs. Peabody his real name. Doggone, thought Henry, doggone it all anyway. Why did this have to go and happen? He felt sorry for Ramona. Actually felt sorry for her. This was really the last straw. He did not want to feel sorry for Ramona in that stupid old journal bag of hers. He tried hard not to feel sorry for her, but he could not help himself. Come on, Ramona, he said, even though he didn't want to. Get on the sled and I will pull you home. I will help, said Beatrice gratefully. She lifted her little sister onto the sled in front of Henry's papers. Now hang on. Henry and Bejas took the rope and began to pull the sled. By this time, the streets were almost empty of cars and they could run, sleeping and sliding on the snow that had been packed down into ice. Ramona stopped crying and yelled between Snape's smash. Oh, keep quiet, said Henry rudely. He was in no mood to play sled dog for Ramona. He did not feel that sorry for her. Oh, thank you, Henry, said Bejas when they had deposited Ramona on her front steps. I don't know how I would ever have got her home without your help. That's okay, said Henry gruffly, and retraced his steps to start his route once more, and all because of Ramona. It seemed to Henry that he had never had an hour's time delivering papers, not even when there was an extra thick Sunday edition. Half his papers had to be delivered to the door, or at least stuffed into the mailbox. He was too warm inside his car coat, but an icy wind began to blow through his trousers, chilling his legs. His boots were heavy and his gloves were wet again. He was tired, cross, and hungry. By the time Henry had delivered his last paper and dragged his lad home again, it was dark and snow and falling through patches of light cast by the street lamps. Henry, I was beginning to worry about you, said Mrs. Huggins when he had stamped the snow off his boots and entered the kitchen. It takes longer to deliver papers in the snow, Mr. Huggins pointed out. It sure does, Dad, agreed Henry. It sure does. And he thought, especially when someone like Ramona like on the road. The next day, the snow had stopped and the sun shone on a sparkling world. The city began to recover. Snowplows cleared the main streets, and the late afternoon, most of Henry's neighbors had shoveled their walks. Henry was rested, but so was Ramona as soon as he started his paper route. There she was again wearing her little journal bag. Henry wished all the snow was cleared away so he could ride his bicycle again. Ramona, still very good, tagged along, and all the people who were now shoveling their driveways stopped working and smiled and said, I see you have a little shadow. There was nothing Henry could do about it. A line of the poem he had once had to speak in a school kept running through his head. I have a little shadow that goes in and out with me, and what can be the use of him is more than I can see. Boy, whoever wrote that poem knew what he was talking about. The third day, just enough snow had fallen to freeze on the cleared sidewalks and make them too slippery for Henry to ride his bicycle. Because delivering papers was still difficult, Henry and the other boys gathered early to fold and count the papers. Henry was almost ready to start his route when Mr. Caper came around to check on the boys. He grinned at Henry. Well, Henry, he said, I see you got your name in the paper. Who, me? Asked Henry in surprise. Yes, Henry Huggins, said Mr. Caper, opening a paper right here on the editorial page. Henry could not understand what Mr. Caper was talking about. What would his name be doing on the editorial page or any place else in the paper? It must be some other Henry Huggins. Mr. Caper began to read, "Dear Editor." Henry understood that much. Someone had written a letter to the newspaper. "Dear Editor," Mr. Caper read, "I wish to call attention to the firework a boy named Henry Huggins is doing delivering the journal in our neighborhood." "Hey, that's me," exclaimed Henry. "I told you," said Mr. Caper, and continued reading for all the boys to hear. Henry is always prompt and courteous, but it was yesterday during the heavy snow that I was particularly impressed with his work. Delivering papers that day was not easy, but Henry went out of his way to ring my doorbell and hang me my paper so that it would not get in a snowdrift. Not only that, he took time out from his route to give a little girl who was cold and tired and ride home on his sled. And the journal should be proud of these fine young citizens. Sincerely yours, Basie Peabody. At first, Henry was speechless, and then he felt as if he was suddenly growing about 4 inches taller. All the other carriers looked at Henry with respect. "Boy, I wish somebody would write a letter like that about me," said Scooter. I have been delivering papers 3 years and nobody ever wrote a letter about me," said Joe. "Me neither," said all the other boys. "And Henry is our youngest carrier," Mr. Caper reminded them. He gave Henry a friendly slap on the shoulder. "And keep up the good work, Henry. I'm proud of you." Henry felt himself grow another inch. Mr. Caper was proud of him. He had said so in front of all the other boys. On his way down the driveway, Henry passed Ramona with her little journal bag over the shoulders. She slipped on an icy spot and sat down hard. Before she could start to howl, Henry boosted her to her feet because he suddenly realized that if it weren't for Ramona, Mrs. Peabody would have written a letter to the journal praising Harry Huggins, and Mr. Caper would have thought it was about a carrier in some other neighborhood. Henry knew he had had a very close call. "Careful and don't fall again," he cautioned, "and Ramona, you might get hurt." Then he started delivering papers with Ramona following 10 feet behind him. Today, this did not bother him. Mr. Caper was proud of him, so he did not care who tagged after him. Besides, he was too busy thinking what his father would say when he read Mrs. Peabody's letter in his evening paper. Henry decided not to say anything to his father. He would let him discover the letter for himself. His father would be reading along, and all of a sudden he would see Henry's name in the paper. He would probably be so surprised he would just about jump out of his chair. That evening, it seemed to Henry that his father never would get around to reading the paper. First, he dawdled over his dessert and asked for a second cup of coffee. "Why are you so restless tonight?" Mr. Huggins asked Henry. "Me, I'm not restless," said Henry, wishing his father would hurry up and drink that coffee. "I will carry your dishes into the kitchen, Dad," Henry offered. Mr. Huggins looked surprised. He got up from the table and remarked, "Maybe I will build a fire in the fireplace. It's such a cold night." "That's funny, Dad," said Henry. "I was just thinking it was awfully warm in here." Mr. Huggins turned on the television set. That was too much for Henry, and he couldn't wait any longer. Said, "Dad, did you read tonight's paper?" he asked. I glanced at the headlines. "Why?" "Well, I just wonder if you happened to read the editorial page," said Henry. "Not yet." Mr. Huggins looked curiously at his son. "Why are you so interested?" "I got my name in the paper." Henry could not keep the pride out of his voice. On the editorial page, Mr. Huggins sounded disbelieving as he reached for the evening paper. He folded it back to the editorial page. There, Henry pointed at the leader. "What is it?" asked Mrs. Huggins, coming in from the kitchen. She leaned over her husband's shoulder to read. "Why, Henry!" she exclaimed. "Wasn't that a nice thing for Miss Peabody to do for you?" "Henry, I'm proud of you," said Mr. Huggins. "I don't care how much snow there is. I'm going right out and buy half a dozen papers so we can send copies of these to your relatives." "Gee, thanks, Dad," said Henry modestly. He had waited a long time to hear his father say he was proud of him. "I will admit that when you took on the route and then got mixed up in building a clubhouse, I didn't think you could handle it, but you have done a good job," said Mr. Huggins. Henry was pleased and at the same time a little embarrassed by his praise from his father. Mr. Huggins went to the hall closet and put on his overcoat and hat. "By the way," he remarked, "how much more money do you need for that sleeping bag?" "About $5, Henry admitted. Mr. Huggins took out his wallet and opened it and handed Henry a $5 bill. "There you are. Tomorrow you go to the sporting goods store and buy that sleeping bag." "Thanks, Dad." Henry accepted the bill. "You mean I can sleep out in the clubhouse when there is snow?" Mrs. Huggins spoke up. "You may not. Do you think I want you catching your death of cold?" "But the sleeping bag is filled with down," and Henry pointed out. "It's nice and warm." "I don't care," said Mrs. Huggins. "You can't sleep out until you have some warm, dry weather." "Okay, Mom." Henry was agreeable because he had not really accepted his mother to let him sleep outdoors in the snow. He would have the sleeping bag, and that was what counted. That and knowing his father and Mr. Caper were proud of him and realized he could handle a paper road. "Coming with me?" Henry asked Mr. Huggins. "Sure, Dad." Henry pulled his coat out of the closet. "Good old Mrs. Peabody," he thought to himself as he put on his cap and pulled the ear flaps down over his ears. "I knew she would be the best customer or my road. He picked up the paper to admire his name in print once more, and as he looked at it, he could not help thinking, good old Ramona. That's all.